This is Gareth Aden, and I am here as a representative of the Nashville Bar Association Historical Committee, and we're working on the oral history project of the NBA. It's my pleasure today to be interviewing a leader in Nashville litigation practice, Zan Blue. Zan, good morning.
Good morning, Garrett. Thank you for having me.
Zan, tell us first of all, just your full name, when you were born, and where you were born.
My name is William Alexander Blue. I'm called Zan. Anybody who calls me anything other than Zan is selling me something. I was born in a town called Leakesville, North Carolina in 1958. We moved out of Leakesville while I was a very small child, and they promptly changed the name of the town to Eden, which I take as a personal affront.
Where was Leakesville located?
Leakesville is near the Tri-Cities area, Greensboro area, and it's right near the Virginia border.
Let's talk for a minute about your family, beginning with your father. Could you give us his full name and where he grew up?
His name is William Alexander Blue. He was born and raised in Parkton, North Carolina, which is in the southeastern part of the state. It's a small town that I watched grow over the years from having one stop sign to one flashing red light and one stop sign. My mother is Brenda Bateman Blue. She was born and raised in Draper, North Carolina, which is immediately adjacent to Leakesville. It's Leakesville, Spray, and Draper were consolidated to form Eden.
What did your father do, say?
My father started his career as an accountant with a degree from the University of North Carolina. And over the years, he moved up in the corporate world to the point where by the time he retired, he was a senior executive working for the Baron Thyssen-Bornemisza of Monaco as the Baron's representative here in the United States with respect to buying, selling, rehabbing companies.
My understanding is from just chatting with you that if the Baron wanted to do something by way of buying a business or opening a business in the United States, your dad was the man he called.
I'm sure the Baron had a number of people that he called, but my father was among them, yes.
Tell us about your mom.
My mother, who is now 81 years old, she just spent a week with us. We're very happy to have her here for a week. She now lives in McLean, Virginia with my sister Martha. Mother had a wide variety of things that she did over the years, most significantly raising me and my four little sisters as we moved around the United States.
How did you manage to survive with four younger sisters?
I didn't know any better.
Tell me a little bit more. Obviously, as we're going to learn, somebody emphasized education in the Blue family. Was it your dad or your mom, or both?
It was both. There was, in my house, it wasn't a question of whether you were going to go to college, it was where you're going to go to college. And graduating from high school wasn't considered a particularly significant event.
Tell me about your sips, the four sisters,
Yeah, I have
their names and where they are and what they're doing.
four little sisters. Laura is a cop. She retired as an associate chief or assistant chief, whatever they called them, in Orlando, and promptly took a job as the chief of police in the city of Belle Reve, I think it's just south of Orlando. Sister Malia is a school teacher. She lives in Camden, South Carolina with her husband, Tom. Sister Martha now lives in McLean, Virginia. She is one of those people who was multiplying three-digit numbers in her head when she was in high school. And she now works as a consultant, primarily serving nonprofits and raising two very fine children, Maddie and Alexander. Sister Maria, the youngest, is a lawyer. She's in Charlotte, North Carolina. She is an associate general counsel for Sunbelt Rentals.
Tell me a little bit about growing up and the various moves that your family made, where you lived, and your education early on.
Well, back in those days, corporations transferred their executives on a pretty regular basis. It was not at all uncommon. And we started out in North Carolina. I'm sure I can't get the sequence straight, but we went from North Carolina to upstate New York. Then I think back to North Carolina. Among the places we lived were North Carolina, upstate New York, Madera, California, West Caldwell, New Jersey, and Belleville, Illinois. I lived in eight different places before I went to college.
How did you do in school? Probably since your mom allowed you to live and go on, you did well, I'm guessing.
I did well. I went to, high school was high school. I went to high school for 3 years on an accelerated program because I didn't like high school. So I went to summer school so I could get it over with. I went to Bradley University in Peoria, Illinois, because they gave me money.
Well, let you know a little known gem actually of a school.
Mhm.
It's and you only hear about it every now and then from basketball.
They had a very prominent basketball program long before I went there. But I attended Bradley University in Peoria, Illinois. I got a degree in philosophy.
Did you work while you were in college?
I painted houses. I was a house painter, and that's how I put myself to college. By the time I was ready to leave college, I had 2 crews working for me doing residential work. And we made one disastrous foray into the commercial world, but other than that, we just stuck to doing houses.
So you paid for your own college education.
For the most part, I would say yes.
What did you study in college? What areas really interested you?
I was a philosophy major, and there was a very small philosophy department at Bradley. There were 4 professors, and there were probably, I think there were 5 philosophy majors. So we got a lot of one-on-one attention. I spent a lot of time over at business school doing accounting classes and general business classes.
Zan, did you work in college during the summers, or did you just go straight through in school?
In college, in the summers, for the most part, I did work. I was painting houses.
And you began college with 30 credits you brought out of high school.
Back in those days, there was something called the CLEP test, C-L-E-P. I don't know what it stands for. But back in those days, you could take the CLEP test by paying a fee, and depending upon your scores, you walked out of that process with college credits. I can't remember for sure whether I got 24 or 30, but by the time I went to Bradley, I had already completed enough to finish freshman year.
And so you spent 3 years before you graduated college.
I was at Bradley from 76 to 79.
Anything else during that period that we need to talk about, or was it mainly just doing the work at school and making, I presume, good grades?
That was basically it. I mean, I was just doing my thing.
What were your plans after graduation from Bradley?
The plan was to go to law school. And the reason for that was that the professors that I talked to explained to me that you're not going to make a living as a philosophy major doing really anything. And one particular professor, W.D.S. Whitty, told me that I needed to go to law school because he believed every person has a skill, every person has a gift. And he said that mine was analytical. So he said, you need to go to law school.
Well, after 50 years of law practice. I think he summarized the skill of law pretty well. Yeah. Where did you choose to go, or did you think about a number of schools, or just hone in on one?
I considered a number of different schools, applied to a number of schools, and visited a few. I went over to the Tri-Cities area in North Carolina and visited, and truth be told, they kind of acted like they were going to do me a favor by taking a lot of money and letting me go to school there. I went to Vanderbilt, and I spent a half a day with the associate dean, Don Hall, at the time. And Don, who was just one of the greatest guys ever, he was just a fantastic guy. Don acted like I was a customer. And he put on a big sales pitch, and I was terribly impressed. And Vanderbilt accepted me, and that's where I went.
Did you have help on tuition from Vanderbilt? Or did you have to work in law school to pay tuition?
After I finished, I had money set aside to go to school, and so I had a financial plan. After my first year, Vanderbilt got a new chancellor, and the new chancellor promptly jacked the tuition for the business school and the law school, saying he was going to charge what the market would bear. And my recollection is, in effect, it doubled the tuition overnight. I went to visit Dean Bostic and explained to him that this was not part of my financial plan. This was not something that I anticipated, and it was not something that I was interested in. I remember that Dean Bostic told me, well, you can borrow whatever you need to borrow. And I said, well, Dean, that's not really what I've got in mind either, because that doesn't make any financial sense. And Dean Bostic and I had a conversation in which I said, you know, the University of Tennessee would be happy to have me. And I don't really want to have to go there, but that's what I'll do. That's what I need to do from a financial standpoint. It probably helped that I had Archie B. Markham Medal in my pocket at the time from being first in my class in my first year. And Dean Bostic called a nice lady who came in, and somehow they found some money.
That's not surprising. That's a great story. And I think, now you tell me if I'm wrong, but I believe you ended up being first in your class each of your 3 years at Vanderbilt Law School.
That's a true statement.
Did they give an award for that?
It's called the Founders Medal. It's a very nice gold medal that they drape around your neck at the graduation ceremony. It's a Founders Medal from each of the major schools. It's a very nice ceremony. It's a very humbling award.
Favorite professors or great stories from law school?
CrimCon Don, as we all affectionately refer to him, Don Hall was unquestionably one of all the students' favorites. He was just a great guy, a really good teacher. He made things understandable. It was just fantastic in every way. The civil procedure professor was John Mark Stinsbach. And I don't know what happened to John Mark. He might be out at the University of Iowa School of Law now. John Mark had the ability to explain civil procedure in a way that if you listened carefully and paid attention to him, everything just fell into place and made perfect sense. He was also notable because John Mark wanted all the students to sit in the same seat for the entire semester, and he had this board that had everybody's face and name on it so that he called on you by name. John Wade of Prosser, Wade and Schwartz was at Vanderbilt at that time. He was getting on in years. I remember John Wade came into class one time. Professor Wade came in and walked down the aisle. He said, well, Prosser's dead. I guess that makes me number one. He was quite a hoot, Professor Wade was. There were a lot of really great professors. Hal Mayer was a fantastic professor. He taught some kind of weird areas of law.
Exactly.
Not too many people would take conflicts of law and that sort of thing. Law at sea, I think he did. But Hal was an amazing teacher. And I think I took every course he offered just because he was the professor.
Let's go to the point where you're getting ready to graduate from Vanderbilt. You've had a top-notch career in law school. What did you decide to do?
I wanted to do labor and employment law. And one reason for that is the experience I had at the commercial painting site in Peoria, where a local union guy came and told me that all of the employees would have to sign up and join the union and pay union dues and so on and so forth. And I didn't understand what was going on. One of the guys on the crew saw the guy, and he was right out of central casting. I mean, he was a little guy, a little mustache, little suit with an arrow tie, big black car with a driver. I mean, it really was. It was right out of central casting. It was kind of hysterical. And I told him, I don't think my guys want to do that. And he said, well, I'm not sure you understand the situation, but I'm not asking. And one of the fellows who worked for me was named Andrew. I'll not mention his last name. Andrew was a member of the weightlifting team at Bradley University. Who knew they had such a thing? And Andrew picked the guy up and put him back in his vehicle. It got a little dicey after that, and I made darn sure I never painted another commercial building in Peoria again.
But that obviously made an impression on you.
Well, it did. I thought it was fascinating, and I did a lot of reading and just general research about it. And it seemed to me that labor and employment law was a field of law where you were never going to get rich, but you could make a good living. But most importantly, you were working with actual human beings. You weren't doing commercial paper. You weren't doing meets and bounds. You weren't doing that dry corporate type stuff. You were actually dealing with people at their workplace, which for most people is the second most important thing in their lives.
So, if it's labor law, tell us what you decided to do so far as where to practice and who to practice with.
Well, there was a firm in Nashville, Costagny, Brooks and Smith, that were part of a regional firm. At that time, the firm had about 30 lawyers in 4 cities that were in Atlanta, Nashville, Birmingham, Columbia, South Carolina. And I went down to their office. It was in the old First American Center on the 24th floor, and invited myself to meet with Terry Brooks, who at that time was the managing partner, and told him that I wanted to come to work for the firm. And he understandably was like, who are you? Why are you here? What's happening here? And he sent me away, and I went back a couple of weeks later, and he sent me away, and I went back a couple of weeks later, and finally Terry said, persistence is a wonderful quality. You got a job. And this was in April of 1983. It was April of 1981 in the second semester of my first year at Vanderbilt.
Right. So you sort of clerked there during law school when you got the time.
I did. I worked there while school was in session, and then I worked there all summer.
At that time, could you give us a little history or a profile of Costagny and Brooks, what they did? You mentioned a few towns, where they were located, how they operate.
Yeah, at that time, Costagny, Brooks and Smith was one of the 3 major labor firms in the United States. All 3 firms were based in the United States, or were based in the Southeast. There was what is now the Ogletree firm, which is one of the powerhouses. And there was the Thompson firm, which no longer exists. And there was Costagny. And those 3 firms represented most of the non-union management companies in the southeastern United States. Costagny's focus was on the textile industry. and Costagny at that time represented most of the major textile companies in the United States, with the exception of J.P. Stevens. Mr. Costagny, according to urban legend, and I don't know if this is true or not, but Mr. Costagny declined to represent J.P. Stevens because he didn't care for the way they handled their union-related matters.
What was the office here in Nashville like? Who were the main players? What did you do?
Terry Brooks was the managing partner. He was the younger brother of Lubbock Brooks. Lubbock was the Costagny Brooks guy. Larry Bridgesmith, who is now over at Lipscomb, and I think he's got an affiliation with Vanderbilt, was there, and there were just the three of us. Most of what I did was whatever they told me to do. I did a lot of work researching arbitration case law. We did a lot of labor arbitrations in those days, and I would do the research before the hearings and working on the briefs. Most of what the firm as a whole did at that time was traditional labor law, what is now known as traditional labor law. It's union management relations. There was some employment discrimination work, but at that time, employment discrimination work was a relatively small part of the firm's practice. Right after I joined the firm full time, Ed Cates, who was a great mentor and is a fine fellow, he's retired now. Ed brought me in to work on a old-fashioned, what is now an old-fashioned across-the-board race discrimination action that was being prosecuted in federal court in Athens, Georgia. It was Callaway versus Westinghouse. And it was the old-fashioned kind. There was bona fide seniority defense. There was all kinds of statistical evidence. And it was what at that time was a major lawsuit. And I worked on that for months. Around the same time, the second major thing I was doing, in addition to the day-to-day stuff, is, and this was a few years later, but the trucking industry got deregulated. And as part of deregulation, the union's hold on the industry rapidly began to weaken. And some executives with the company then known as Consolidated Freightways believed that the unionized trucking industry was not going to survive. And so they decided they were going to engage Jim Smith of Costagny, Brooks and Smith. And Mr. Smith's assignment was to help the company form non-union regional subsidiaries. And my assignment was to do what was called the what if memo. And my job was to think up every possible way that the Teamsters could use the National Master Freight Agreement to challenge the formation of non-union subsidiaries. I did that for months and months and months.
Was there a lot of travel involved in your practice in those years?
We were, Mr. Brooks would tell people that from Sunday afternoon until Thursday night, you belong to the firm. You go wherever we tell you to go. And that's what we did. We carried around we carried around what was called the OAG, which was a booklet about like Yay that had all the flight schedules in it. And in our other pocket, we carried around flight checks. And you could take a flight check and literally walk up to the gate at the airport, fill out the flight check, hand it to the person working the gate, and get on the plane.
I remember you mentioning that term, and I didn't know what it meant or what it allowed you to do, but
It was literally a universal flight check. Every airline accepted.
tell me about a case that you had mentioned to me when we talked, and I think was out of South Carolina that you were right fond of because it was such an unusual situation.
Yeah, that was a case for Mohasco, parent company of Mohawk. And George Smith, at Constantia Brooks and Smith, there were two Smiths. It was George Smith and Jim Smith. George Smith called me up one day and said, I want you to be in Dillon, South Carolina, the day after tomorrow at 8 a.m. And I allowed us how I had to do some stuff for other partners. And Mr. Smith explained that apparently I didn't speak clearly enough. So I was in Dillon, South Carolina, 2 days hence at 8 a.m. I remember the morning very well because it was hot and everything was covered with yellow pine dust. I met Mr. Smith in the parking lot, and Mr. Smith explained to me that the fellow who was running the private trucking fleet from Mohasco had been in an automobile accident. And the company had learned that a great many checks were coming in to the trucking facility, and nobody knew what they were for. It didn't make any sense. And Mr. Smith then told me to go inside that brick building where Dennis had his office and figure it out. So I did. I went in there, and I guess I was playing Sherlock Holmes. I was trying to figure it out. I was young and stupid and arrogant and thought I could do it. And I went in and I searched and examined everything I could examine. Found a lot of stuff that didn't really make any sense because at that time, the trucking industry, once again, had just been deregulated. And under trucking regulation, all the tariffs were set, all the rates were set, routes were set, I mean, everything was set for the common carriers. Private fleets, it was a different situation. And private fleets under regulation weren't allowed to carry other people's freight. Well, under deregulation, all that changed. And this was soon after deregulation, so it was kind of chaotic. Anyway, I went in there and I examined his office and I found all the stuff that you're not supposed to find, the bottles of liquor and the pornographic magazines, all the other stuff. And for some reason that I cannot explain to this day, I looked at the typewriter and the typewriter had one of those little single-use ribbons. And so I popped the ribbon out, stuck it in my bag, and figure out what's on it someday, somehow. We came back, I came back to Nashville, and Barry's son, Lance, was a great kid. And I gave the ribbon to Lance and said, you gotta do it a certain way, but I want to know what was typed using that ribbon. Well, Lance did his thing with his usual efficiency and accuracy. And we figured out that Dennis was writing checks on that typewriter. Lots and lots of checks. And I called a fellow named Dick Palazzo with Conway Central Express. You'll remember I mentioned that earlier. And Dick was an executive with Conway Central Express. And I called him up and I said, Dick, if you were going to run a scam and you were in charge of a corporation's private fleet, what would you do? And Dick said, well, that's easy. I'd run backhauls using trucks because the trucks go out full and under regulation, they had to come back empty. But now they can pick up a load and bring it back somewhere in the general vicinity of their base and pick up some money. And that's what Dennis was doing. Dennis just didn't tell Mohasco about that. And Mohasco was not happy about this. So we wound up suing Dennis and we got a federal order seizing his properties. And federal marshals went to the bank where we found out he had a safe deposit box. And marshals showed up at 9:10 and Dennis had left the bank at 9:05 with a pillowcase slung over his shoulder, which was, we figured, for cash, which in fact it was. It was quite a lawsuit. I wound up subpoenaing all the banks in South Carolina. That didn't make people happy. We did a lot of stuff. We wound up recovering some fraction of what Dennis took. I don't know. We'll never know how much.
Yeah.
We got something like $265,000 out of it. There are lots of stories related to that case. That's the gist of it.
Fascinating. All right. I guess we're now what, roughly in the late 90s. You've been practicing almost 15 years. Were you a partner by 2000?
I became a partner in 1991.
91. Okay.
I think that's right.
How many people were operating at that time or about 2000 in the Nashville office? Had it grown very much?
The business model that Costagny used and still does use is to have relatively small office in lots of locations so that we're able to serve clients in all over the place. So at that time, around 2000 or so, the firm had a number of national clients. And this was sort of a paradigm for labor and employment firms at the time. The firms would represent national clients and use the local offices to handle it. So the local offices were typically relatively small, 4 to 7 lawyers, maybe 8. And so we had a small firm atmosphere in the local offices, but we're part of a much larger firm that had the resources that we would need to handle matters.
As we're coming to about 2000, there was a pretty profound change, I believe, that was taking place in labor/employment law. Can you take a minute, be a good professor, and tell us a little bit about what that change was and how it affected not just law practice, but your practice?
Well, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the vast majority of work done by labor and employment boutique firms was union management stuff. And for our firm, a lot of that was in the textile industry, a lot of carpets, garment manufacturing, and that was in the process of moving offshore because of cost reasons. With the Civil Rights Act of 1964, there came a new set of causes of action for employment discrimination claims. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 had a fee shifting provision, which at that time was a fairly novel idea. And the idea of the fee shifting provision was to encourage plaintiffs' lawyers to take the cases. The remedies were limited, however, so you could only get back pay and attorney's fees, and the plaintiff's bar wasn't real wild about that. In the 80s, the state courts began developing common law employment causes of action for wrongful discharge and violation of public policy. The original ones were claims where the employees said they were terminated because they had obtained workers' compensation benefits. Frampton versus Indiana Gas was one of the first out of Indiana. Clanton versus Kane Sloan, which was handed down in 1984, was the Tennessee Supreme Court's first foray into creating a common law employment cause of action. The importance of that with respect to the development of practice was these causes of action were sort of a weird hybrid of contract and tort. And so they provided for tort remedies, which would attract the personal injury lawyers. In 1991, Congress amended the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to include compensatory and punitive damages subject to caps, along with the fee shifting provisions that have always existed. So the combination of the newly created common law employment tort type claims and the addition of the availability of compensatory damages along with fee shifting in the Civil Rights Act of 1991 created a boom in employment litigation. Because now it was much more lucrative for the plaintiff's bar and they had a much more powerful incentive to take the cases. So through the 90s, the mix of practice for our firm went from, let's say, 66% traditional labor union management stuff, and it turned on its head. So by 2000, it was probably 66% employment litigation.
Fascinating. I do remember that period between 1990 basically and 2000 when you did get the feeling that there was a big expansion happening in the employment realm in terms of being able to go to court and going to court.
Well, there was, and the whole idea of those changes was to encourage plaintiffs' lawyers to take the cases and thereby fulfill the policy goals of the anti-discrimination statutes. There was also an explosion of statutes. You had the Age Discrimination and Employment Act. You had the Americans with Disabilities Act, a veritable alphabet soup. So there was a tremendous expansion of individual rights in the employment setting through that period of time. And there was a simultaneous decline in the power of organized labor in the United States. And there's a lot of discussion about cause and effect, whether the individual rights development caused that. I don't pretend to know the answer. All I know is in the real world, the power of organized labor and their ability to organize new workplaces dramatically declined, and the ability of individuals to assert their rights in the workplace through litigation dramatically increased.
This was a fascinating period, I'm sure, for you. Did that cause your practice to take on an element of teaching? That is to say, employers who weren't familiar with the changes that were taking place.
That was one of those periods of time where you couldn't really see the forest for the trees. So a lot of times it was hard to really understand what was happening. There was, prior to the transformation from labor to employment, we did a lot of work in the management training area, teaching supervisors and managers how to conduct their employee relations in such a way that their employees would not believe that the union would be necessary. That training gradually changed to include a focus on what the discrimination laws provided, what you should and should not do, how you should proceed with respect to matters of race, age, national origin, gender, so forth.
Did this change the nature of Zan Blue's practice in any way, insofar as things like travel or the type of employment that you had, or the type of practice that you had?
Well, for me personally, there was a huge shift from doing the union management stuff, where frankly, I was part of the team. We would send a team to work a major union campaign, and I was part of that team. The nature of my practice shifted so that I was doing much more litigation. And so I literally was doing depositions and court appearances, particularly all over the southeastern United States, but also into the Midwest and to some extent out on the West Coast. And this was litigation stuff. At that time, employment law really was a specialty. Most of the general practice firms didn't have employment lawyers. They didn't know how to do it. They didn't want to do it. They would refer cases to us. Today, of course, every major firm has an employment law section.
Yeah. In terms of cases, and I'm sure with your background, there are probably 100 you could talk about, but one case that you had mentioned to me that I thought was fascinating because of the unusualness of the occupation is the worm farm case.
The worm farm case.
Tell us about
that. There is a company in Tennessee called Silverbait. And Silverbait was founded by Bruno Durant and his wonderful wife, Veronique Durant. And Bruno and Veronique came to the United States from France, literally to pursue the American dream. Genuine American dream story. they believed there was opportunity in America that they would not have in France. So Bruno, it's a long story. The bottom line is Bruno bought some land in Grundy County, which Bruno believed was at the proper elevation to maximize the proper temperature for the growing of worms. Earthworms grow best within a particular temperature range, and Bruno believed that this land was located at the right elevation. He bought the land and formed what was virtually a fully integrated operation. The only things that Bruno bought were peat out of Canada, lime from wherever he got lime, and the baby worms, as Bruno referred to them, the baby worms, which he bought by the pallet from some outfit in Belgium, strangely enough. Bruno, who is an absolute genius, he built all of this himself. He built the worm farm houses. He obtained chicken litter and chicken manure to fertilize his cornfields, so he didn't have to use herbicides or pesticides. He grew his own corn. He milled his own corn. He literally bought his equipment off of eBay and fixed it himself. And he had a whole operation going. Bruno's corporate lawyer told him at the time he formed Silverbait in Grundy County that the operation would be covered by the agricultural exemption to the Fair Labor Standards Act, so Bruno didn't have to pay overtime. And so Bruno didn't. Well, time passed, and eventually Bruno got sued by a law firm who claimed that he wasn't operating a farm within the meaning of the agricultural exemption because raising worms wasn't farming. To this day, I'm not sure exactly how Bruno wound up calling me, but he did. And we took the case. Eventually, we tried the case in front of Judge Mattias down in Chattanooga. We won. My favorite moments of the trial was when Judge Mattias was asking me, well, just tell me why you think this is a farm. And I said, well, Judge, I just tell you, I've been there. And, you know, they grow corn and they got tractors and they got plows and they got discs and they got harvest equipment and it looks like a farm. And Judge, you wander around out there and it's dirty and it's a farm. So, Judge, I'll just tell you, it looks like a farm, it sounds like a farm, and let me assure you, Judge, it smells like a farm. And everybody got a good laugh, with the possible exception of opposing counsel, who may not have thought it was quite as funny as I did. In the event, we won the case. The Sixth Circuit affirmed per curiam, a precedent-setting decision, but the most important part of the case was Bruno literally bet the farm. And if Bruno had lost that case, he probably would have lost the farm. He literally bet the farm. And we won the case. And I'm pretty sure that Bruno's paying those people overtime today, just because Bruno's Bruno.
And he's been successful, we hope.
Bruno's one of those guys who would be successful no matter what he did.
That's a good one. It's one you can look back on and realize that there was something really good you did with your talents. What other cases? I think you mentioned a listeria case with a meat processing plant.
Yeah, the listeria wasn't the case. There was a listeria outbreak in the United States some years ago, and it was traced to meatpacking plants. And one of the largest meatpacking operations in the country, I believe they had 9 plants scattered all the way from Northern California to the southeastern United States. They engaged our firm to lead a series of wall-to-wall audits at each of their meatpacking facilities. And we had on the team, we had a senior executive from one of the sister companies because we didn't want the people at the plant to be in charge. So we have a sister company's executive. We had food safety experts. We had an occupational safety and health expert. And we had 2 of our lawyers examining the employment issues. And our teams, I was leading the project, and our teams went to each of the meatpacking facilities the company had in the United States, all the way from the kill plant in New Bern, Tennessee, to the corn dog plant down in Arlington. And we went into every single plant and we examined every single operation. And it was a fascinating process because during all of that, I learned more about meat packing and kill plants and how to make hot dogs and how to process chicken and process turkey than any lawyer should ever know.
Is Sarah Lee still a client?
Sarah Lee, I don't do any work with them. I don't think they're a firm client. Sarah Lee's not the same organization it was at that time. This was a long time ago. There's all kinds of corporate transformation since then.
Were you still doing some NLRB work also after 2000?
I've always done some amount of that. I've negotiated some contracts for some companies, some transformative contracts that were using, they typically, some of these companies were using law firms that had a more traditional method of operating with respect to labor unions. And one particular company in Indianapolis, they came to us and to me because they wanted a approach to negotiating the union contract that was fundamentally different, which basically was, we don't really care what you want. We're going to do what we're going to do. Right. And so one of the niches I developed over the years was negotiating transformative contracts, where you would take a contract that had been in the same form for the last 20 or 30 or even 40 years and renegotiate it into a modern contract that respected the union, respected the employees, but got rid of the onerous work rules that were strangling the company. The reason many unionized companies have such a difficult time is not because of the wages and the benefits, it's because of the work rules. There's lots of stories I could tell about that, but the bottom line really is the work rules are what strangle the companies.
Today, 2022 or the 2020s, has your practice changed dramatically from what it was 20 years ago?
The most dramatic change in my practice is a number of years ago, I decided I wasn't going to live on the road anymore. And truth be told, a lot of that is just the result of the travel industry creating a process for travel is just miserable for a business person. The aggravations at the airports, the aggravations at the hotels, the amount of time you waste traveling, which frankly never really registered with me until the last 2 years. I decided a number of years ago that I wasn't going to do that anymore. So my practice now is much more focused locally. I spend a lot more time doing general advice, a lot more time managing litigation, teaching younger lawyers, a lot less time doing stuff myself.
Well, that brings me to a question that I meant to ask you a moment ago. Has your firm, you might want to even just trace it a little bit, but let's say since 2000, has your office or has the entire firm of Costagny and Brooks changed very much?
Well, when I joined the firm in 1981, we had 4 offices and about 30, 35 lawyers. Today, we have 27 or 28 offices. 175 lawyers. We have offices from San Francisco with an outpost in Seattle, offices from San Francisco to Jacksonville, from LA to Boston, and many places in between. Our chair, Neil Wasser, who has been with the firm longer than me, I've only been there 41 years. Neil has done a fantastic job of leading the firm into becoming a truly national firm where we can serve a client in virtually any location, while simultaneously having each of our offices maintain a very strong local presence so that we can serve our clients in a particular area where our office is.
Who are your local attorneys with Costagny right now?
Teresa Boult, who is a fantastic lawyer and is kind of sort of, I guess, my boss, even though I hired her. Teresa is the firm's general counsel and is the firm's general administrative partner. And she does a great job in both of those capacities, as well as serving a number of national clients. Mary Donor Smith, who is a very important person in many things, but including the Tennessee Bar Association. Mary Donor Smith is the other equity partner with Teresa and I in the firm. And Mary, as I say, she has a very significant leadership role in the Tennessee Bar Association, does a fantastic job, and is a fantastic litigator. Mary is just an absolutely brilliant lawyer when it comes to litigation.
Well, let's not sell you short. The Nashville Bar Association, I think in bar work is the way I got to know you, and I know you've been active locally.
Garrett, the way you got to know me was you were the Bar Association president, and you nominated me to be the chair of the, what was that committee? It was the committee responsible for the continuing legal education process.
CLE.
And you put me in that job with the instruction, and I deliberately didn't tell you beforehand I was going to do this. You put me in that job and told me to get in there and make this thing profitable because we're losing our shirts. That's exactly what you did. And you didn't tell me that I was going to be in there on a committee with a bunch of people who believed that it was entirely a community service for the Bar Association to do CLE, and it was somehow inappropriate for us to make a profit.
I think I made a good decision there.
Well, I think
I
what
think
you
I
did
did.
was bushwhack me. I think that's what you did. I remember the conversation well, and over the years I thought about it, the next few years, when I'm arguing with people that we have to charge a higher fee. And I'm thinking to myself that Gareth Aiden put me in here and he knew exactly what he was doing, that rascal.
Well, I did, and as a matter of fact, it was proven to be true because later you received a very prestigious award from the Nashville Bar Association. Tell us about that.
I was working very closely with Susan Blair, who was the CLE director for the Bar Association, and Susan, who's just an absolutely delightful woman, and she did a great job. And I did a lot of CLE programs. I worked with Susan on strategy for CLE programming for the bar. We talked a lot about how to operate it as a quasi business. A lot of community service, a lot of focus on doing things that would help the attorneys and the bar as a whole, but with the recognition that we got to make a profit here.
We've got to keep the doors.
We got to keep the doors open. And eventually, and I don't remember when this was, but eventually the Bar Association was kind enough to give me the CLE award, Excellence in CLE award, I think it was called, I don't remember. It's a lovely, coveted crystal plaque thing.
You deserved it, and I can attest to that. You know, Zane, you have also, and a lot of folks may not know this, but you've been a member of the Tennessee Business Roundtable for a while. Tell us about your work there.
I joined the roundtable many years ago, and the idea at that time was to participate in a nonprofit organization that had the focus of improving the business and employment community for all of Tennessee, all the Tennesseans. I served as treasurer for, I don't know, 10, 12, and I don't have a lot of years. And I'm currently the general counsel. The objective of the Tennessee Business Roundtable is to influence policy decisions in a positive way that will improve the atmosphere for employers and employees throughout the state of Tennessee. Historically, our greatest focus has been on education, all the way from kindergarten to higher education. In recent years, our focus has been on workforce development, and most specifically skills training for high school students and skills training at the community colleges. Tennessee is a national leader as a result of the work of a great many people, including the Roundtable. Tennessee is a national leader with respect to our community college program. And as the audience may know, in Tennessee, thanks to the work of a great many people and some leadership from the governor's office and the General Assembly, any high school student in Tennessee who graduates can go and get an education at a community college for a couple of years, first dollar paid. It's a wonderful development. It's a tremendous development for workforce development.
Well, I 100% agree. And I can speak to that because I've done work with the Boy Scouts, a couple of boys who literally gotten their higher education through. You've done work also, and I don't want to forget this, with judicial selection. Tell me about that.
Back in the 2010 to 2014 timeframe, there was a major issue in Tennessee about the manner in which our appellate court judges were selected. And the late, great John J. Hooker was filing lawsuits left and right, claiming that the method by which we selected and retained our appellate court judges was contrary to the state constitution. And truth be told, he had a point. So an effort was initiated, and many of the leaders of the bar throughout the state of Tennessee and the business community as well worked very hard to put a constitutional amendment on a referendum vote to amend the Constitution to address the issue once and for all and adopt the Tennessee plan for the merit selection of our appellate court judges. The Tennessee Business Roundtable, again, along with many others, was a leader in that effort. And I spent a great deal of time working on that with the Bar Association, because at that time, I think I was one of 3 lawyers on the board. Dan Haskell was one of them, and he did a great job. But, you know, the business community, generally speaking, doesn't sit around thinking about how we select our appellate court judges. It's not something that they really think about often. So Dan and I and many others spent a lot of time working on that, and we successfully got the Constitution amended so that that is settled once and for all.
Well, it's a great contribution to law practice, believe me. And I think almost everyone in the bar feels that way. Let's loop around for a moment to your private life. I know you're married, you have children. Tell us about your wife, what she does, and your children.
I'm married to Francie Lycus. She is a rock star in every way. Francie is a family nurse practitioner. She is a certified nurse midwife. She has a doctorate in public health from the University of North Carolina, which she got on a Fulbright scholarship. She is absolutely brilliant. And Francie just retired after spending, I think it was 14 years as the editor-in-chief of the Fancy Pants peer-reviewed Journal of Midwifery and Family Health. So I think she's the greatest woman ever born myself. I have two children, Sander, who is living in Minneapolis now and does something with computers I don't even pretend to understand. He may be a professional hacker for all I know. And he's married to Allie, a cardiologist, and they just had the first grandchild about 3 weeks ago.
Congratulations.
So Leah Ann has joined our ranks, and Francie and I are going to be going to visit here in a few weeks. My daughter Nikki is, by coincidence, also in Minneapolis. Nikki is an inveterate do-gooder. She does everything she can to make the world a better place. She is the community coordinator for the Meals on Wheels program, and she's married to Steve Garth, a Nashville native, born and raised. Steve is a mathematician of the type that has a whiteboard with all the squiggly stuff on it. I don't have the slightest idea what he does either. They're both wonderful, wonderful people, and they do a great job.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. Let's take, if you don't mind, a minute, and let you sort of summarize or look back on law practice, what you've experienced. Tell us what you think are the things that have been good during your years of practice, what's not going the right direction, in your opinion.
I think what is good is that as a society, we have done a much better job of demystifying the law. We have done a much better job of making legal services accessible to people. We've got a long way to go. We haven't done as good a job as we should. The Tennessee Supreme Court has, as long as I can remember, put incredible emphasis on pro bono work, which is a very good thing. So in many ways, we've done a much better job of making the law and the legal process more accessible to more people. Where we're not doing such a good job is I think the practice of law has become too focused on making money. You know, if you're a lawyer, you're going to make a pretty good living. I mean, we've got a guild, right? Not everybody can practice law. And when you have a guild, the members of the guild tend to make a pretty good living. I think that in the last 20 years, there has been a commercialization of the practice of law. And I don't just mean through advertising and mass marketing. I mean, in the development of these mega firms that have hundreds or thousands of lawyers, and they're operating a business. My concern is that being a lawyer is slowly changing from being a true learned profession to being more of a craft. One of the things that I'm concerned about for the long-term future is whether the practice of law is going to go in the direction of the practice of medicine, where the private practice of medicine has largely become obsolete. And a great many doctors now are employed by hospital networks and huge practices. It's a corporate type environment. There's lots of reasons for that, largely having to do with the bureaucracy and regulatory environment, such that a private medical practice has a very, very hard time being successful because the doctors have to spend so much time doing stuff other than practicing law or practicing medicine. They signed up to practice medicine. They didn't sign up to argue with insurance companies and deal with billing problems and all that kind of stuff. The legal business is, in my opinion, headed in that direction. And I don't think that's going to be a positive development in the long term.
Thank you. A few questions and then I'm basically through. One is, what do you enjoy doing? What are the things that outside of law practice or outside of your community service you do, sports, things like that?
I was having a conversation with Francie last night, wondering why it is I can't go to Percy Warner and walk 9 holes of golf every morning. It's a good question. I don't have a good reason.
You
good
could
answer
change
for it.
that, you know.
Hmm?
You could change that.
Well, that's exactly what she said. That's exactly what she said. I like to play golf. It's the only sport that I'm any good at all. And on a good day, I can play bogey golf from the gold tees, and that's pretty good. I like it. I enjoy it. And I like golf because it's a game that you can play from the time you're a kid until the time you're very old. In the fall, I spend a lot of time deer hunting. I like to ride my tractor and putz around on my land down in Giles County. I like to be outside and, as I say, work on my tractor, ride around on my mule, putz around in the woods, that sort of thing.
I understand that you and Francie also travel.
Francie and I, until the pandemic came, we were on a steady course of at least one major trip a year. For a number of years, we would go to Central America, through Belize and Costa Rica and so forth. We shifted to Europe and we visited London, Paris, Prague, Budapest, Florence, Italy, a number of other places. And next week, Francie is going to France with her mother, her sister, and beloved niece and beloved nephew. And I'm going to go over and meet them in Florence, Italy in about 2 weeks. And we're very much looking forward to that. One of the things Francie and I enjoy doing very much, and we do it very well together, is travel. We have a standing, she does all the planning, and I do what I'm told. And we have one basic rule, which is only one of us is allowed to have a meltdown at any given point in time.
Saying this has been a tough life. Is there anything further that we haven't covered that you'd like to speak to?
Well, I think this is a tremendous project, Garrett. I think it's great that you guys are spending all this time and effort to record an oral history of the bar of Nashville. You know, one of the things that I think about from time to time is that I take great pride in being a member of the Nashville Bar. You know, I just tried a lawsuit in front of Judge Bankley, and Brad Gilmore and Frank Lena were on the other side. And at the closing argument, I told the judge, I'm very proud to be a member of the Nashville Bar. This litigation has been hard fought over a long period of time. And as I told Judge Bankley and told Brad and Frank, I'm very proud to be able to say that throughout the entire course of that litigation, everything was handled with a high level of professionalism, professional courtesy. And even as we were bitterly disagreeing about things, we were never disagreeable about it. And I think that's a credit to Brad and to Frank. But I really think it's a credit to the Nashville Bar as a whole.
Well, it's a credit to you for keeping up that tradition because it's something I learned right off the bat from Harlan Dodson, Tyree Harris, and John Hooker. That one of the best things in law practice is you can make war all day in court and then go out and have a wonderful meal with your opponent.
Well, that's right. And that's why, you know, one of the traditions of Nashville lawyers is no matter where you appear in court, no matter where it is, whether I'm in the federal court of appeals or I'm in some rural court in northern Indiana, when I stand up, Your Honor, I'm Zan Blue, the Nashville Bar. Glad to be here.
Stan, thank you very much for taking your time to add to our oral history. And you've done it well. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Garrett. I really appreciate you guys doing this. It's a great project.